Professor Smart, let's turn to slide 60 here. Now, could you let us know, in comparison with Mr. Hutchings' similar-ish chart on slide 211, how does your table here on slide 60 compare in terms of helpfulness to the court?
I'll talk about the specific factual differences. Our table is presented in present.
Oh, sorry, slide 60 up on the screen, please.
To point out that may be.
Excuse me, could I just ask you to bring me that sheet on my desk? It's a slide 211.
Oh, would you just like to work from the copy here?
I've already started annotating.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Thank you very much. Go ahead.
You asked me to contrast my slide 60 with Mr. Hutchings' slide 211. This is my slide 60. The differences that I see as important are as follows. Our table presents differences in present value dollars. And for completeness, we include Mr. Hutchings' own present values as well as ours.
Okay.
That means that numbers presented in this table, added up across years, are already in comparable units of present value in the year 2020. Second, we try to take a holistic approach. We start with, well, how big is the difference between us to be explained? And then we ask, what are the major items that can explain the difference? Mr. Hutchings takes a more bottom-up approach here. He says, well, suppose, well, I don't wish to speak in his voice, Your Honor. He selects individual items that are in dispute, and he values those individual items rather than ever valuing the totality of the difference and trying to decompose it. And when he presents those individual items, he does it in nominal dollars, which, as I argued before, cannot be added across years or compared across years in a way that is economically meaningful.
And just for the court's reference, your table on slide 60 is the same as the table you present on slide 47, less the notes on slide 47.
Yes.
Would you like to see the slide 47 again, or?
No, I know that to be true. The numbers in the table are the same. They're repeated here because we've come to the conclusion of my discussion of the specific issues enumerated here. And I want to remind everyone, and of course, the court, of the bottom line impacts of all of these issues we've just discussed.
Is there anything else that you'd like to tell the court about slide 60?
There's a new footnote on this slide. Again, for the purposes merely of summation of our previous discussion, I've also mentioned here that in this context of comparing the Hutchings accounts to the Bodway Smart accounts, we would also look at differences in included revenue before we discussed the two important places in which Mr. Hutchings included revenue from MPT and logging tax, which we do not feel should have been included. And it gives the dollar amounts, present value dollar amounts for those two, we think, erroneous inclusions at $60 million and $1.6 billion province-wide, respectively.
Those present value amounts, are they using your rates or Mr. Hutchings' rates or something else?
Those are our rates.
And when I see 60 million and 1.6 billion, those are present value rates?
Yes.
And everything on this page on slide 60 is present value rate?
Yes.
Great, so let's proceed to slide 61. Please tell us about slide 61.
I propose now to talk for some time about Mr. Hutchings' approach to Crown expenses after 1945 and the ways in which our opinion differs. And of course, here there are great differences in our respective approaches. Mr. Hutchings uses the PAO up to 1945 in the ways we've discussed. After 1945, he does not rely in any way on the specific PAO expense data, that is the specific information in the PEO on expenses of these departments after 1945. It plays no role in his calculations, whereas we continue to use the same techniques as we did before 1945. What Mr. Hutchings does instead, beginning in 1946, is to assume that expenses should be 31.9% of the non-water revenues of the Crown in each year. And so if, for example, non-water resource revenues were $100 million, then he would simply assume that the expenses to be included in his accounts would be $31.9 million in that individual year. The 31.9% is the average share of expenses in those revenues in his own accounts for each year between 1898 and 1945. So as we said, he did rely on data before that. He made different choices about inclusion than we did. Using his approaches and his accounts, the average value over those 47 or 48 years would be 31.9%. And he assumed that exactly that 31.9% should apply every year thereafter. One observation about this, one issue of contention between us and Mr. Hutchings is the losses in NCRs that we estimate in the later years after 1960. By making this assumption, Mr. Hutchings has guaranteed by assumption that there can be no NCR losses. Expenses are always 31.9% of revenues year by year. Therefore, they cannot ever be higher. Expenses cannot ever be higher than revenues, and NCR losses can never occur. That is an assumption of Mr. Hutchings' analysis, not a result.
Or, well, is it not the result of taking a 31.9% view of expenses?
Well, yes, it is, but it's a result that flows immediately from that assumption with no steps in between. Economists typically, part of our methodology is to distinguish between the things that we assume and then the things that we may conclude from the data. In this case, there's no distance between those. The data didn't allow him to conclude there were no losses after 1945. The assumption did. The assumption all by itself, no matter what the data were, he would still arrive at that same conclusion. And that's what I mean when I say it flows entirely from the assumption.
Would you like to tell us about the second main bullet on this slide 61?
Well, we don't think that this assumption is reasonable. We can't see a reason in the data or in the economics why expenses would be a constant share of revenues. So his model doesn't seem to be validated in that sense. Indeed, if you look at Mr. Hutchings' own work papers for the years from 1850 to 1945, that share of expenses to revenues varies widely from year to year. It varies between 0% in at least 1 year to a maximum of 4,027%. In other words, there's 1 year in which expenses were 40 times as high as revenues in that year. So Mr. Hutchings doesn't claim it stays constant, Question is whether those data offer a firm basis for assuming that it would remain roughly constant in subsequent years, that it would be centered around 31.9%, as it had been centered around that percentage in the previous 48 years. And because of the volatility, the annual variability in that share in his own data, it does not seem reasonable to make that assumption of a constant share thereafter. Moreover, it's not purely random variation from year to year. The expenses were already rising as a proportion of revenues in the years after World War I up to the end of World War II, from 1919 to 1945. In Mr. Hutchings' own data, there was a steady rise in that expense share year by year over those 27 years. And as an economist, if I were attempting to predict what would happen in the future from data observed in the past, I would tend to put more weight on recent years as a better predictor, or better information to inform a prediction than earlier years. Mr. Hutchings' decision to average that share over the entire period from 1898 appears suspect in light of that rising share in his own data over the prior 28 years. Probably the share in the prior decade would be a better predictor. Knowing the share in the prior decade, or averaging over the prior decade, Mr. Hutchings were to do that instead of over all 48 years, he would have arrived at a 45% share of expenses and revenue instead of his 31.9%. That, of course, would materially affect his calculations after 1945. I don't think 45% would be the best prediction either. The fact that it had already been trending up would suggest an even higher percentage would be appropriate. The rising share of expense and revenue over that prior few decades since World War I would have predicted to continue. And I will show you theory and evidence for why it was trending upwards over time.
What would you say about the last main bullet on this slide 61?
With your permission, Mr. Lipton, I propose to say nothing. We've discussed the issues that are in that bullet extensively. Of course, ask questions if you wish.
So is it true that expenses incurred after 1945 could be referable to expenses to revenues earned before 1945?
But yes, indeed, the bullet says essentially what I was just asked. There are connections between or references between expenses and revenues before and after. In this case, I think the main point is that we would not expect expenses to rise in tandem with revenues post 1945 because of these linkages. The revenues before 1945 might be relevant for what we think of as appropriate expenses after 1945, and vice versa, because of these cross-temporal linkages that we talked about. For example, in mining rehabilitation following after the revenues, and reforestation either following after the harvest or before the next harvest of those newly planted trees. Both of those suggest we can't just look at revenues in the current year in order to determine the appropriate or the reasonable level of expense in that particular year.
Let's move on to slide 62. Could you please tell us about that slide?
Still on what happened after 1945. Well, what happened is Mr. Hutchings changed his technique, his approach. He notes that there were changes in resource policies of the Crown after 1945, and we agree with that. There were changes, no sharp change in 1945, but there were substantial changes over a period of years around that. And as we would characterize it, there was a renewed and increased, there was greater focus on preserving resource stocks and restoring resource stocks. And that meant, above all, reforestation. It became a new priority of the Crown after 1945. Well, even before 1945, the Department of Lands and Forests was already engaging in changes to its policies and changes to its administrative practices to increase its focus on reforestation and conservation. I would trace it really to 1943, the time at which the ministry started to change what it was doing for these reasons. But 1945 is a reasonable watershed date. Another important date is 1947, with the release of the Ontario Royal Commission on Forestry, which talked about the need to conserve and restore forest resources and proposed changes to the department to make that happen.
Could you tell us about the third sub-bullet under the first main bullet?
There was a reorganization of the department. It first appears in the public accounts in the 1943 edition. One element of that reorganization was the introduction of what the department called its basic organization function. So the accounts start to look different because of the introduction in the accounts of what they called basic organization. But the reorganization was a broader phenomenon, right? Affected more than accounting, affected practices in the department. To understand that the purpose of that reorganization and the impacts it had, I turned again to the administrative history, Lambert and Pross. They discuss it in detail. And they wrote the words on this slide. They wrote, quote, "The long-range goal of this reorganization in 1943 was to meet," and they're quoting as well, "the vital need for a planned conservation program." So the administrative history says this happened beginning in 1943 to meet the vital need for a planned conservation program. We agree. We agree the department started to spend more on reforestation and other aspects of forest management intended to conserve and enhance the timber resources on Crown lands. Now, not quite now, I'll pause, excuse me.
Go ahead.
Now, it appears Mr. Hutchings and I and Professor Bodway agree there was this change, really watershed change around 1945 and what the department was doing. We believe it was to spend more on reforestation and related functions. Notice the implications of that for Mr. Hutchings' approach to the data. He counts zero reforestation before 1945. We believe there was a change in 1945, which was to increase spending on reforestation. But his method will never capture that, will never capture a reasonable measure of the Crown's post-1945 reforestation spending, because he relies solely on data in a period in which he believes there was no reforestation in Northern Ontario. And certainly, we must all agree there's very little reforestation in his data. So he can't capture through his method that the impacts of that change on the NCR accounts that even he, I think, would like to generate after 1945.
So you get to that the Hutchings method will never capture increased spending because it's an increase from, because his 31.9 is based on zero and it doesn't capture a trend. It doesn't capture a change.
Doesn't capture that change, Your Honor, exactly. And so even if one were to accept that approach and that 31.9% as being relevant in the light of the Crown's policies up to 1945, as you understand, Bodway and I do not accept that. But if one were to accept that, it's a reasonable approach, but then take on board the fact that the Crown started anew in 1945 to focus on reforestation, the 31.9% could not be correct.
If Mr. Hutchings had captured this reforestation policy change, would his expense ratio for the post 1945 period have been higher?
I believe that it would. That your question involves certain conjectures. I think the reasonable answer is yes, it would have been higher.
Right, let's move on to slide 63. Could you please tell us about slide 63?
Still on the same subject of the reorganization, but now focusing on this particular accounting change, the introduction of the basic organization function in our accounts beginning in 1943. The point that I wish to make is that the basic organization function comprises resource management programs and not overhead or administrative programs of the department. And I want to do this because in reading the transcript of Mr. Hutchings' testimony, I thought he might have created some confusion on that point. His own reports with Solo and with Professor Stiglitz did not address basic organization, but in his testimony, he introduced this history as a reason for ignoring the PAO data in the way that he did. He wrote on slide 167 of his demonstratives, what I've written here, that after 1945, quote, a large portion of departmental expenses were reported as basic organization. This lack of detail is compounded by the rise in overhead expenses. Those are his words. I think that it's somewhat ambiguous what he's trying to say, but I think that one might, possible that some people reading or hearing those words would infer that he meant to say that the basic organization function was an administrative function. And I'll back that interpretation up by showing you another of the slides in which he talked about basic organization and the way he talked about it. In fact, I suggest we'll go there right now if you're willing, Mr. Lipton.
Sure, let's go to slide 64 for a moment before returning.
So this is slide 168 from his demonstratives. I'm sorry, it is very small.
It's bigger over there.
Yeah, I got it. But it was small in his slides too. In this case, I will share them.
Oh, sorry, if you could go back to slide 64, please.
Okay, so here's his slide. Right after he's introduced this idea of compounded by the rise in overhead, he shows a snapshot of the 1951 public accounts of Ontario. So these are some of the data that we rely on after 1945 that he chooses not to. And notice that the first component of what's reported for the DLF in that year is the main office. And he highlights the 1,500,000 spent on main office. We agree that's overhead. Then he highlights the total spending on basic organization dash district offices. Those two highlighted amounts, then through the arrows, one is referred to, the eye is drawn to the box in which he writes 87+%. That's the sum of those two numbers, Your Honor, divided by the ministry total, also highlighted. 87+% is mixed expenses with no way, economically meaningful way to attribute. We know what he meant by that. He meant that there was no economically meaningful way to attribute those main office plus basic organization spending programs to resource management functions. And I disagree with that completely.
Does Mr. Hutchings in this slide 168 in his demonstratives appear to equate main office and basic organization?
Equate them in the sense of categorizing both of them as overhead programs to be apportioned and only partially included. It's possible that he did mean that. I think that one might take it to mean that.
Let's return to slide 63.
Before we do, I will simply say, in showing this and saying, therefore, there's not enough information in the 1951 PAO to use for our purposes, I would not, that's what Mr. Hutchings was saying, I wouldn't want his statements to leave anyone with the impression that that is all the information in the PAO for that year about basic organization. That's the summary table. There are additional sub-aggregates of the spending of basic organization offered on the subsequent pages, typically in the years around 1951. I haven't reviewed that particular one. The norm would be there would be another 5 to 10 pages of detail on what the basic organization spending was.
Right, so let's return to slide 63. I don't believe that you have spoken to the third bullet on this slide.
And this question is whether there was this rise in overhead around 1945 that would lead us to abandon the PAO. In our opinion, there was no substantial increase in administrative expense as a share of the relevant ministry totals. I've written, as the figures on slide 60 show, I'm afraid that's wrong. It's slide 66 in the current version of the deck. We will get there shortly, I hope. Well, I'll show you what we think was happening to administrative expense over time.
I believe it's 66 and 67.
Correct. So the point is basic.
Sorry, just please stay on slide 64 for now, or 63 for now. Sorry, please go ahead.
So my point is that basic organization was not overhead. I wouldn't want anyone to infer that. Instead, it was the DLF's decentralized forest management activities. So it was forest management, but it was now decentralized to the district offices across the province and across Northern Ontario. That practice led to a change in accounting in the PAO that applied for the years 1943 through 1968. But what they were doing in those district offices was forest management.
And let's turn to slide 65. Please tell us about slide 65.
So I'd like to support the statement that I just made, that basic organization was resource management. It was created when the department decentralized its resource management activities from Toronto to the regional offices. That certainly happened and led to the change in accounting. As I read the history, the intention of that change was to improve services and increase resource management, the success of the resource management programs. That's why decentralization happened. To support that assertion, I've offered two more short quotes from the administrative history describing what the department was doing and why. Do you want me to read it out loud?
Sure.
Okay. Lambert and Pross wrote, quote, "The policy was to be remodeled so as to bring about controlled management of resources through a functional and geographic reorganization of the field service." Term field service and basic organization are synonymous. They're used interchangeably. They also talk about the field offices. I just said district offices. All of these refer to specific places at which the department officials were located. And here we're discussing what they were doing at those locations in the field. These reorganizations would bring about a much needed decentralization of activities. So again, the administrative history supports the idea decentralization from head office in Toronto to the district offices had the intent of improving resource management. Second quotation says, quote, the structure of the field organization or basic organization was straightforward. There were generally two branches of the department in those field offices, forestry branch and lands branch. So our question now is, can the PAO be relied on to measure resource management expenses? If we see basic organization here, should we conclude that that's an overhead function akin to the main office, or that it's a resource management function? I believe these words from the administrative history tell us that those people in the district offices accounted for as basic organization were involved in two things: forestry branch activities and lands branch activities.
What kind of work were they doing in the forestry branch around this time, roughly speaking?
All aspects of what we called forest management before were in those offices other than policy development. So that would include forest protection activities, insect control, fire management activities. It would also include replanting, reforestation, and various kinds of research related to disease control or silviculture. A lot of that was happening. There were separate branches that handled some elements of that, but when it came to providing those services in the field to the forest within the various areas of the province, it was forestry branch in the district offices that were handling those things.
And that is from the, you get that from the PAO? You get that data or that reassurance from the PAO?
I really don't. Mr. Hutchings is right about this. There is less detail in the PAO about what basic organization did. After 1943, when that term is introduced, we see the spending was on basic organization. Then we typically will see, well, where was it spent? So they will assign a total for each of the district offices. They'll say the economic classification of the spending, how much went to the salaries of employees, how much went to transfer payments, to capital acquisitions. We have those kind of details as well, but we don't have the same detailed functional disaggregation into the intent of the spending that we would like to have, and that in some previous years we did have more information on. I agree with Mr. Hutchings. So we have to turn to other sources to understand what the programmatic functions were that spending through the basic organization supported. And that's why I've included these quotes. It says there really was no change. Forestry branch still existed, but now it existed inside these district field offices. And so it was aggregated up in the accounts and called basic organization. But this quote tells me forestry branch still existed as a function.
Well, the reason I asked the question is because you could take that from Lambert and Pross. That's what they did. But you specifically listed they did forest management, insect control, fire management, reforestation.
That comes.
Are you presuming that from what they say? Or do you see that, do you footnote that to something?
I'm drawing that inference based on my knowledge, which is gleaned from a combination of the public accounts and the secondary sources, not limited to, but including the Lambert and Pross book I'm quoting here. There is, of course, far more detail in the book than I'm quoting to you. There is some detail in the PAO, as I said, and one might, and to the extent that it's possible, we use that additional information in order to get our accounts right and to apportion things where necessary. One might ask, well, what else could basic organization have included that we wouldn't wish to include? We went through the public accounts to determine answers to that question and act appropriately. So for example, in some years, the PAO indicates the basic organization included parks programs. In other years, it indicates it doesn't include parks programs. Based on those types, information of that type, we're able to develop an estimate of what portion of basic organization was parks in the years in which we know parks was included. We do an apportionment exercise of that kind based on the PAO. Again, the question would be, what else could be happening inside the basic organization, inside the field offices that we would want to exclude? we conclude that it was forestry and lands management activities based on our primary and secondary sources. But it's in all years, we have to make do, Your Honor, with the information we have. It's not complete by any means, and it does get worse after 1943. That's correct.
So,
The
so,
level of detail is less after 1943.
so while you say, I mean, there are other people to do the cross-examination, but I'm just trying to understand it. While you say earlier, we know that forest management expenses are going up. There's a trend, there's an upward trend. Pre-1945, we would expect that to continue. Because it's not disaggregated, you don't know if there's more money spent in insect control or in fire prevention.
If those functions went through the field offices in these years, we don't have that detail. That's true. But that detail would not be germane to the calculations that need to be done under our approach.
Under that's right, under your approach. Okay. Sorry, disaggregation.
We wouldn't need to know about firefighting versus insect control because we want to include them both.
Got it. Thank you.
Did Mr. Hutchings refer to the Lambert and Pross book in his reports?
Yes.
In this second quote on slide 65, you refer to the lands branch. Roughly speaking, what kind of work was the ministry doing through the lands branch?
That would include land surveys and land administration, various recorder functions, registration of patenting of land, all of that would go through lands branch. In the more modern era, it would include more sophisticated kinds of
GIS.
geomatics information.
Were the kind of expenses in the lands branch that you just referenced the type of expenses that Mr. Hutchings included before 1945?
I believe the answer is yes, because lands are less important quantitatively in this case. I've made a less detailed investigation of his approach for lands, but I believe so. I believe he includes them.
Do you have anything to add on the last bullet of slide 65?
If I could summarize our opinion, it is that basic organization, as we see it in the accounts, was resource management activities, not overhead, however that term is construed. The intent of that change was to improve resource conservation and therefore to support rents in future. And we believe it can't be excluded. There's nothing here that would lead us to want to exclude basic organization from our calculations, as Mr. Hutchings did.
Could you please tell us about slide 66?
So the broader point that Mr. Hutchings is making here around basic organization and the changes after 1945 is that, again, quoting him, paragraph 121 of his report, his point is that after 1945, quote, general overhead expenses began to grow rapidly. We do not agree with that statement as we define overhead. So to support my claim that there was no marked change in the pattern of expenses of the ministries around 1945, I performed the same colorful block analysis of expense as before, but I'll do it now twice. Once for the period from 1898 to 1945, where Mr. Hutchings regards the data as acceptable. And then after 1945, when he regards the rise in overhead as indicating the data are not reliable. And so if we compare the size of the administration expense blocks between those two periods, we'd learn about whether that statement is true or not. So before 1945 on slide 66, the administration expense block is in the upper left corner in green. There's also a much smaller block labeled basic organization, which is sort of in the middle right. He would also consider that overhead, we don't. And then I'll note again that we have a category that we call forest management. We don't, it's a variety of different programs. It would include fire management, fire protection, disease control, and so on, as well as timber management in some cases. Sometimes we don't have enough detail even before 1945, but we know enough to know that it's about protecting the forest or managing the forest. So it would be in that category. Okay, so for us, administration is the upper left before 1945. If we look at slide 67, we see the same comparison after 1945. The administration block moves because a computer has its own way of doing things, but you can see that it's roughly the same size block as before. On that basis, we conclude there was no marked change in the administrative overhead of the department.
I'm sorry, I missed something when you first started. Did you have forest management, for instance, as a big block?
Yeah.
Does that come from what the PAO tells you basic organization is doing?
No, Your Honor. Where expenses for the 1943 to 1968 period are labeled in the PAO as basic organization, with, I think, two exceptions I'll mention shortly. I simply code that as basic organization, and it appears in the blocks called basic organization
Okay.
here. The
So,
two,
sorry.
You know what? It's possible that I'm just confused because when I look at this, at slide 66, I thought it was after 1945, but the figure is still pre 1945.
right, for our data, we use a consistent approach throughout the full period. Previously, I showed you a similar picture for the full period, 1898 to 2019.
Right.
Now I'm just breaking it into two separate time periods, and I'm asking, is Mr. Hutchings correct that there was a lot more administration in the later period?
So if you look at the figure on slide 66,
Yes.
it's easier to see on the screen, but there is actually a small box above forest management labeled basic organization.
Yes.
And that's because, as Professor Smart testified, the basic organization change actually began in 1943. So it is captured
In 43.
in this figure. And then if you flip to the next figure on slide 67,
That's
you'll see once again that the forest management box in the lower left is distinct from the basic organization box, a little bit hard to see in the green at the top. It's
Right.
the third box from the left.
I see it. Thank you.
So that's just how the figures look.
And so the question that I asked earlier, where do you get the information that about forest management, the size of this block? You make an inference.
I make a categorization of specific line items that we find in the PAO year by year. I assign them to one of the categories you see here based on the words that are in the PAO and the other things that I know by reading other sources.
So let's start with the first figure then. In the period of 1898 to 1945, how did you distinguish what in this figure you're calling forest management from what you're calling basic organization in this figure? How did you distinguish those two?
Well, all of that forest management, no, excuse me, I'm going to correct myself and not finish that sentence. Forest management it's a catch-all category for us. It's spending that we know was related to management of forests, the various kinds of scientific and administrative functions I discussed before that support forest programs. If they're not explicitly disaggregated in the PAO in any given year into their components, we put it into a category called forest management. So in some years, fire management would be a separate category in the PAO, in which case I would put it into fire management, excuse me. In other years, fire management would be subsumed within the forestry branch expenses before 1943. And in those cases, I don't know what portion of forestry branch, even before 1943, was fire management, what was other such forestry related functions. And so I categorize all of such spending on forestry branch as forest management. After 1943, I introduced this new program, this new category, basic organization, because the accounts change and because Mr. Hutchings raised this issue about basic organization. But as I said, I believe all of that is these generic forest management functions of the old forestry branch. It's still there, but accounted for differently, plus the lands branch in the district offices.
Were there, in this first figure on slide 66, before 1943, were there any expenses that you categorized as basic organization?
Not before 1943. There should be no such expenses before 1943.
And if we flip to slide 67, the figure on slide 67, again, there is a box labeled basic organization. Were there any expenses that you categorized as basic organization after 1968?
I don't believe so. The 1968 may not be fully accurate. The Department of Lands and Forests existed until fiscal 1969 or 1970. It may be there was still some things reported as basic organization in those final 2 years, but certainly not after that. So I believe 1968 is the dividing point. I may be wrong by 1 year or even 2.
A dividing point from lands and forests to MNR?
Yes, and therefore the end of the basic organization function reporting.
How can we tell from these two figures on slide 66 and slide 67 that there was no marked change in expense patterns?
I draw that inference because the block labeled admin, meaning administrative, main office, or overhead spending, doesn't get much larger in the second figure than the first figure. And so that allows me to be of the opinion that overhead didn't go up in any marked way, about the same percentage of the total. But of course, in doing that, I am relying on what I knew in order to categorize spending as belonging in that admin block. And also on my opinion that basic organization is not overhead.
Is your question, Mr. Lipton, with respect to forest management when you say expense patterns? Or is it all of it? You spoke to basic organization.
And admin. And
admin.
Simply, excuse me, Your Honor, please finish.
No, I was wondering if your question helpfully, and maybe you answered it, was how do you how do you tell that there was no marked change in expense patterns? You say you draw the inference. I think you're saying you draw the inference because there's no big overall change in expenses, and admin, something that you call admin, doesn't get much larger in the second figure than in the first.
Yes, Your Honor, but it's particularly that last admin category I'm speaking to now. I'm trying to respond to Mr. Hutchings' assertion that overhead rose so much after 1945 that he cannot rely on the PAO anymore to do his calculations. That's the main reason he gave for this fundamental change in his technique in 1945.
Right.
And so I am turning to the data to see whether I agree with the statement that overhead programs, as I understand that term, went up. The overhead programs, as I understand them, are generally perhaps always coded in this admin block. So to respond to Mr. Hutchings' assertion about the rise in overhead, I turn to my accounts and my designation of certain expenses as being admin expenses, same as overhead, basically. Because the admin block doesn't get bigger in the post 45 period, I conclude that Mr. Hutchings is wrong. There wasn't a marked rise in overhead.
In the second figure on slide 67, which covers Ontario Crown expenses from 1946 to 2019, why is the forest management box bigger than in the first figure?
Forest management is a bigger portion of total forest spending after 1946. And that is because there is less detail in the public accounts after 1946. As I said before, it was more commonly true in the early years that when the Crown was spending on firefighting or fire prevention, they told us precisely that in the PAO, and we had that in that. After 1945, more commonly, they don't offer that disaggregation. Instead, they simply tell me that this spending was allocated to a branch that was responsible for forest management functions of various kinds. And so I'm forced to code it in this more generic forest management category, but I believe that all of that should be included. And when I believed that those particular items in the accounts included non-relevant categories like parks, I did my best to take them out.
Are the amounts of excluded expenses bigger in the second figure on slide 67 than in the first figure?
Yes.
Why is that?
And just for the record, Mr. Lipton, when you're saying on slide 67 and 66, you're saying post 1945 and pre 1945.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes, they're sequential, they're chronological, the two figures.
Thank you.
There's no single factor that results in a rise in the spending components of the resource departments that we exclude. So there's no single answer to your question. I can provide some answers category by category. In the case of the mining programs here depicted in purple, as I noted before, there was a sharp rise in general northern development spending after 1970. And that is and we excluded all, and so it's manifested in the big purple excluded block on slide 67. That means mining department now is the Mining and Northern Development Department, known by various names. And so more and more of their spending, although it's in our accounts, we exclude it when we come to our NCR accounts, when we construct our NCR accounts. The forestry excluded expense also rises after, is a larger share after 1946. For the most part, this would be the rise in provincial parks spending, which was handled initially by the Department of Lands and Forests and then by the MNR after 1970. But there's some other programs in MNR which we also exclude, which helps to make that excluded block larger.
I think now is a good time for an afternoon break.
Yeah, I'll just catch up.
We'll recess for 15 minutes. Court will now resume. You may be seated.
Professor Smart, did you want to say anything more about slide 67?
No, I promise I don't.
Fair enough. Let's, could you tell us about slide 68?
Okay. Well, it's been suggested to me that I should try to make the accounting practices in 1950s through the 1970s more exciting for everyone. Perhaps this will do the job. I want to talk about one more aspect of this issue of whether the PAO is sufficiently accurate that we can rely on it for the purposes of this action. And here, I want to introduce to the court's attention, one more document here. That is the 1975 Task Force on Timber Revenue Report. This was an internal working group of the Ontario Treasury who were tasked with determining what the Crown's expenses to support forestry revenue were at that time. And to do that, those Treasury officials met with MNR officials and also industry representatives, and they examined the same public accounts documents that I did for a very similar purpose. They wish to estimate the Crown's spending in support of forestry for the years 1967 through 1974. They relied on the same documents. Of course, they were not interested in RST territory per se. They were interested in the full province for different reasons. They wanted to determine whether revenues were sufficiently high relative to the Crown's support for the industry and for timber activities. So they asked a similar question and they used similar tools to get the answer, even after 1945. Now, I think that that is supportive of my opinion that the PAO can be used to do what we're trying to do here. I think this is evidence that it's a valid exercise, and Mr. Hutchings' claim that it's impossible to do this. You don't simply have to accept my opinion. The expert officials inside the government in 1975 believed it was possible to do what I'm doing. That being said, when they did it, they did arrive at somewhat lower numbers than I do. So I have compared my estimates of, that is from the Bodway Smart approach, the calculations that I did for us, compare our estimates of forest management expenses for each one of those fiscal years. That's reported in the first row of the table at the bottom of slide 68, year by year in nominal millions of dollars. I will compare it to the second row, which is the task force's estimate of forest management expenses for those years. They use the same data sources, the same techniques. They generally included in their accounts the same items from the PAO as I included. That being said, they arrive at a lower number. The third row shows you the percentage difference between their number and our number. For example, in the 1967 fiscal year, they arrive at $25.2 million. We arrive at 29.4 million. The difference is 4.2 million, or 14% of the total that we include. And so on for the other years.
Just Oh, Mr.
Please,
Shack,
yeah,
sorry.
to please the court. I believe the witness and my friend are referring to a document that is not in the productions.
Yes.
My friends provided a copy a couple days ago to everybody. And if we have no objection to it being marked as an exhibit. It's a historical document. So I just wanted to maybe get on with that, make it easier for you.
Sure.
Is that part of the plan?
Yes, that is part of the plan. Don't have a physical copy here. So I think we should enter it as an exhibit tomorrow. But yes, we will be doing so. Thank you. Could you speak to the second bullet on slide 68?
Again, the task force asked a similar question, used the same data sources, and generally reached the same conclusions that I did, in the sense that they included the same expense items. However, they did arrive at a lower figure. The reason is that they apportioned certain administrative expense accounts differently than I do.
They arrived at a lower figure of expenses.
Of Crown expenses in support of forestry, their bottom line figure is lower than mine, even though they started from the same numbers. It seems to be because of the way in which they apportioned administrative expenses.
And the third bullet, could you speak to that, please?
The third bullet, Mr. Schechter's already alluded to this. I didn't know of this document when we were doing our own calculations. I only discovered it in preparation for testimony, wanting to understand basic organization better. I did another search of the library for documents. I found this document. Why is that relevant? First, it explains why the document is not in your book of documents. But second, for economists, this is informative. I didn't rely on this document to develop our methods. If it turns out that the methods that we developed are similar to what was done in 1975, I regard that as reassuring that that my method arrived at independently. It's confirmed by another independent source. Of course, at the same time, the fact that my numbers are different than theirs undermines the validity of my numbers, I must be honest, but only to a limited degree. And I have some opinions about why their number is lower than ours, and why our number still may be more appropriate. That being said, I did want to bring to the court's attention the fact that the numbers from this similar exercise are slightly different than our numbers.
Why do you think your number is more appropriate?
Did I hear that in the evidence?
Sorry?
Did I hear that in the evidence? You thought it was more appropriate?
I did say, Your Honor,
Oh,
that
maybe I missed it.
that although there is a difference here, I have some opinions, not yet stated, of why I think they may have
yes.
arrived at a lower administrative expense apportionment.
Okay.
And I cannot be precise about this because in the document, they don't say what principles they use to apportion those categories that they consider administrative. They just say, we prorated this. And so my answer is pure conjecture, but I would point out to you that the purpose of this exercise was policy related. The question was whether stumpage rates needed to rise in order that the Crown recapture a higher portion of the expenses. And in answering that question, this group of bureaucrats was tasked with determining what those expenses were. They then consulted the industry about it. The industry would have understood, in my opinion, someone who studied the tax policy formation process in my career, I believe that it's likely that the industry would have understood that the answer to the question of what the forest expenses were could have an impact on what the future forest stumpage charges would be. I'm sorry if this to some in the room sounds cynical about the relationship between government and industry, but I think that there would have been pushback from the industry. And the industry would have wished to argue that, well, no, you're not allowed to include those expenses in this accounting exercise. And that inevitably the policy process within government, as much as the intentions of all parties would have been honorable, would have tended to reflect the opinion of the industry here, even though it would not be entirely impartial. I want to emphasize all of that is conjecture, is based on my own understanding of how policy reforms are done in government, particularly as regards to business taxations, business taxation policy, a subject I've studied for many years.
I see on slide 68 in the bottom right-hand corner, it says task force data tables, and it seems to be highlighted in blue. What is that?
That means that if the court wishes, someone could click on that little blue space and you would see the two data tables I'm talking about.
And these are at the end of, are these at the end of your report?
So they're within this demonstrative slide deck in an appendix section at the end. I don't, of course, we cannot read it, and I don't wish to try to speak to it. Perhaps I will, since it's on the screen. I'll just point out that for these years, these are the kinds of categories that we see in the public accounts. We see construction of forest access roads. We see the ranger school within the ministry administration program. We see basic organization and so on. And this tells you how the task force dealt with those categories. We dealt with them in very similar ways, but for this question of apportionment of the overhead expenses. That's all I wish to say.
And just for the record, the slide that Professor Smart was speaking to was slide 151.
Thank
This
you.
is from what page of the document, the report?
It's from the end of the 1970, it's in the 1975 task force report, is that correct?
We don't have a page number here, but we do know it's table 16 of the report.
Table 16,
Table 16.
using Roman numerals, so XVI. All right, so let's go to slide 69 then. Can you please tell us about slide 69?
Still on this question of whether it's appropriate to depart from the PAO after 1945. An issue to be addressed here is the general rise in the cost of government in the post-war era. This is a general phenomenon that economists have noted and studied for many years. Across Western governments after World War II, the amount society spent on government, that is the amount government spent on behalf of societies, rose as a percentage of the overall economy, as a percentage of GDP. That's true in Canada federally, provincially. It's true even provincially within the resource departments. And it's true across the Western world. It's a well enough known phenomenon that we have a name for it. We call it the Baumol effect, after the economist first studied it. Baumol himself called it the cost disease. The reason he called it cost disease is that he hypothesized a particular underlying economic process that was leading for government to occupy a bigger and bigger share of the economy, even though they weren't necessarily doing anything new. They weren't changing what they were doing relative to before. It was just costing them. And Baumol's argument is that what happened after World War II is that wages of all workers started to rise, whether in the private sector or the public sector, workers were paid more. Now, in the private sector, such as in manufacturing firms, that was possible because productivity was rising. Companies were investing in more and more machines that allowed their existing workers to produce more and more output per hour. And the result of that, together with other social phenomena such as unionization, was to cause those private sector companies, such as manufacturing firms, to pay higher hourly wages to their workers. They could afford to do that. The workers wanted to be paid more. But that was a cross-economy phenomenon. Wages went up in the private sector. Wages therefore had to go up in the government sector and in other service, non-manufacturing sectors. But in those other sectors, particularly in government, productivity, output per hour, was not rising nearly as fast as in manufacturing. This is Beaumont's argument, the cost is easy. The result of that is that wages were rising in government sector, productivity was not rising. So in order to do the same things as before, government had to spend more money. They had to pay more to their public servants than they had before. In this case, that implies that Crown resource expenses, which consist almost entirely of salaries paid to government employees or contractors. Crown resource expense is going to rise relative to the GDP or the incomes in the private economy, including the incomes in the resource sector, and therefore it will rise relative to resource revenues of the Crown itself. Government's just getting bigger and taking over, and it's costing more and more for government to do what it was doing before. So in light of the Beaumont effect, it's my view that the rise in the resource spending of the government of Ontario is not an anomaly. It's not a cause for concern per se. It doesn't necessarily any fundamental change in what those ministries were doing, although there were changes in what those ministries were doing. But we would expect an increase in expenses, even relative to revenues, just as a result of this rise in government wages after World War II. So I reached two conclusions from that. The first is that the rise in expense is not a reason to abandon the data, as Mr. Hutchings has asserted. And the second is that if we were to abandon the PAO data, as Mr. Hutchings did, and instead adopt an assumed percentage of revenue as the expense we would include, it would be necessary to adjust that included share over time to capture this Beaumont effect that's driving up the cost of government doing the same things as before, but now paying higher wages to employees.
Take into account generally the rising cost of government.
Yes.
If the Beaumont effect is correct, if Crown policies after 1945 had remained the same as before 1945, would the expenses still have increased?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the first half of your question?
If the Beaumont effect is correct, if the Crown policies after 1945 had remained the same as before 1945, would the expenses after 1945 still have increased?
They would have increased. Yes, they would have increased. And they would have increased not only because of general inflation, but also because of the rise in the cost of government relative to the private sector. So they would have even increased relative to the government's revenues from taxes imposed on the private sector. In every sense, the government could have done the same thing after 1945, but it would have required expenses that were a higher percent of revenues.
Would you like to speak to the last bullet on slide 69?
Not much. It simply says, Mr. Hutchings called attention to the rise in government spending in our accounts. It does rise very fast in these years. But that's an objection to the results, not to the principles. And we would prefer to talk about, we think the appropriate way to reach these conclusions is to talk about the principles.
All right, so let's go to slide 70. Could you please tell us about slide 70?
This is an attempt to depict the phenomena we were talking about before. This is it's a recasting of the data that were depicted in our report, which I hope will be more helpful and more clear. There are 3 lines being depicted from the year 1945 forward. 2 of them represent Government of Ontario's spending. The red line is total spending of all of the Government of Ontario on a consolidated basis. The blue line is just the resource ministries. That's total spending. Now, I want to illustrate to you that the costs of government were going up. And so spending going up is suggestive of that, but we know there are other factors that would drive total spending up, such as general inflation caused the prices of everything to rise. And then an increase in the population of Ontario, which certainly occurred, would tend to drive up spending on government as well. So to take out those 2 effects, I have divided by the increase in the general price level from year to year here, and I've divided by the increase in population over time. So all these series are inflation adjusted dollars per person in Ontario. And yet still you see a marked rise in total government spending per person in inflation adjusted terms, and spending on resource departments, inflation adjusted per person. Indeed, the total cost of government in this sense has increased by 1,200% since 1945. So that's not all due to the Beaumont effect. As well, the government was spending on new programs that after 1945 they didn't have before. But it is the best I can do to illustrate these ideas of the inexorably rising cost of government in Canada.
Well, for instance, you described that post 1945, the spending on reforestation went up. That would be change in government programs, or that would be something. It's not the government doing the same thing and just being less productive.
You're right. Yes, Your Honor, I agree. It wouldn't be a dramatic policy change in the sense that reforestation was already part of the mandate of the department, but they were, of course, planting more acres per year after 1945 and before. Now, the third line in this figure is instead Mr. Hutchings' assumed included expenses from 1945 forward. This is from his work papers. These are the numbers that precisely go into his NCR accounts. But again, here I've adjusted his nominal data for inflation, and I've divided by population, even just to put them on the same scale as these other 2 figures showing the general rise in government costs. So in these inflation adjusted per capita terms, Mr. Hutchings' included expenses are not rising in the same way that general government is. Indeed, they're actually trending downward over time. His spending in inflation adjusted per person terms is getting smaller over time. So not only does he not capture the Beaumont effect driving up the cost of government, his accounts actually go in the other direction. That presumption must be, the only presumption that could support that declining cost amount, in my opinion, is that the government could keep doing the same thing, because that's what he's trying to capture, at a lower cost than before. And I regard that as implausible given the Beaumont effect. Instead, if he were to adopt his model of a presumed share of revenues to go into spending, he should have adjusted that share over time for the Beaumont effect driving up the cost of government. That was a failure on his part to make his model work in a plausible fashion.
May I ask, in the line you have, the dark line at the bottom that shows Mr. Hutchings' expenses, those are only included expenses. He doesn't say that these are the expenses, period, of the ministry or the department. nor running government.
No, Your Honor. He says that the expenses that are appropriate to include as representing the Crown's expense in support of revenues.
So that's not a comparison to the red line.
The comparison that I'm drawing here is between the evidence that we have that each thing government was doing became more expensive over time due to the Baumol effect, and the evidence that Mr. Hutchings' own estimates of the cost of doing what he says we should measure government doing, supporting revenues. The evidence that his numbers don't reflect that general rise in the cost of government at all. That's why this comparison, I believe, is relevant here. If I were to adopt his assumption, I would seek to adjust for the fact that hiring a forester in the year 2019 cost a lot more than it did in 1945, even relative to the value of the revenues the government was generating.
Just for the record, on slide 70, what does the red line show?
It shows total Ontario government expense.
And what does the blue line show?
The total expenses in the PAO of the resource ministries.
And what does the black line show?
Mr. Hutchings' own assumed included expense based on his 31.9% revenue share model.
Let's move to slide 71.
The next three
Oh,
slides,
hang on a second, please.
sorry.
Oh, could you please tell us about slide 71?
The next three slides, beginning with 71, deal with an issue that Mr. Hutchings raised in his testimony. I regard this issue as quite unimportant. And yet Mr. Hutchings testified about it. I think I am bound to say something in response. The graph that I just showed you of expenses of general government versus resource ministries, a version of it was in our report. In his testimony, Mr. Hutchings showed that figure from our report, and then he rescaled the data. He seemed to object to the fact that we use what economists call a logarithmic scale, in which the changes up and down on the vertical axis represent percentage changes rather than absolute dollar changes. Didn't seem to be familiar with that, or he didn't think it was appropriate. And so he rescaled that graph so that each unit on the vertical axis was $1 instead of 1% of dollars. He may not know that economists looking at a growth process would always do what we did, or he may not have liked it. It's his choice. I just wouldn't want him to leave the court with the sense that whatever he thought he was learning from the rescaled graph. And if you're willing, Mr. Lipton, we can just go ahead and look at the two graphs on the slide 72 and 3.
Sure, so let's go to slide 72. What is this graph?
Here is our report's version of the things that we just talked about: total government expense and total resource ministry expense. But in this case, I use that logarithmic scale, and indeed the colors red and blue are reversed in that case compared to what we looked at on the previous slide. It's the same data precisely.
Is this in one of your reports?
Yes.
Okay, and so now, I'll let the clerk finish. that.
And the red and blue are reversed, i.e. the naming of them is reversed, or that what we're seeing is reversed?
It just happened that the computer, when I produced the same data in the new chart that we reviewed on slide 70, I believe, of this slide deck today.
The top line is still overall government spending.
Right, but there it was red, now it's switched to blue and vice versa.
Right, thank you,
Same data series though.
thank you.
It's a very unhelpful computer. And let's turn to slide 7. So we've looked at slide 72. We have a sense of what that graph looks like. Let's look at slide 73. So what does slide 73 show?
This is Mr. Hutchings' rescaled graph. As far as I know, these are the same data. I believe he said these are the same data, but instead of using the logarithmic or fixed percentage vertical axis scale, he used fixed dollar or non-logarithmic scale. Anyway, it's a rescaled data. He says it's the same input data as before. So I'm not sure what he thought was the point of depicting that. But I wanted to offer a clarification that it's the same data as before. And I regard this, it's harder to learn something from Mr. Hutchings' data. The point we were making before was about the growth of government spending as a whole and the growth of spending of the resource ministries over time. Because of the rescaling, it's just hard to see what those figures are now, or to see that they're growing at the same percentage rate because he's changed the scale. But I would not want anyone to think that something nefarious was going on that was being uncovered through this rescaling of the data. And I would want to emphasize in particular, as I have in the first line, in the headline of this slide, that neither one of these represents the expenses that we include in our NCR accounts, or in our province-wide accounts. The expenses that we include for the purposes of this matter is every year an amount less than that depicted red line. It's not depicted here, but it's always less than the total of the resource ministries.
But not less than the task force numbers.
No,
Okay, but and these numbers, these three charts are resource ministry. You're just comparing your numbers to bigger numbers within the bureaucracy, within the government.
this is Mr. Hutchings' figure. I'm not sure what point he was trying to make, but we believe it corresponds to exactly the same data on a different scale as in the table on slide 72, which is from our report. And yes, Your Honor, in that case, we were trying to contrast the rate of growth of government spending in the resource departments to the rest of the Ontario government to say they were comparable, they were growing at a similar rate. If anything, resource departments were growing more slowly than the rest of the Ontario government. That was our point. I don't know what Mr. Hutchings' point was. I just wanted the opportunity to answer any questions that might have been raised by the way Mr. Hutchings talked about it.
Thank you.
Right, let's move on to slide 74. Can you please tell us about slide 74?
So we continue on differences between the Hutchings approach and the Bodway Smart approach, but now we'll focus on specific critiques raised by Mr. Hutchings in his reply report and his testimony. We regard them as numerous, but minor in their individual impact and minor in the aggregate. Indeed, with three exceptions that I'm going to discuss, we don't agree with them at all. We think there's no foundation for the critique that Mr. Hutchings raised. Instead, they reflect, as I've written here, either his misunderstanding of what we did or his attempt to substitute his own opinion in favor of our opinion. As well, I do not believe any of them are quantitatively important, these specific points raised by Mr. Hutchings. In that sense, they are immaterial to our bottom line conclusions. That is true in the sense that none of these points individually or taken together are large enough to change our finding that the present value of NCRs cumulative over time amounts to a negative number, and in particular was negative over the last 50 years. In other words, if we are to accept Mr. Hutchings' points about this, most of which pertain to the accounts of the last 50 years, we would be forced to conclude that NCRs were higher than we reported, but they would still be a negative number for those last 50 years in total. And as I said at the beginning of the day yesterday, in our approach, the magnitude of cumulative NCR losses is not germane to our calculation of value. Our calculation of value of annuities here, based on a model in which the Anishinaabe annuitants do not pay any share of those cumulative losses. So Mr. Hutchings' objections are therefore irrelevant to this question of the value of augmented annuities. Crown might have lost more or less, depending on whether you accept our opinion or Mr. Hutchings at the end of the day, but it wouldn't affect the annuities that we have calculated should have been paid in the augmented amounts according to the Vidal-Anderson approach. Now, clarify, not every one of his objections apply to only the last few years, for which this point is absolutely true. Some of them refer to earlier years, and I will discuss what the magnitude of the impacts would be in those cases. But this is true. This is simply true. Any changes to our NCR accounts in recent years, which raised NCRs, but still left the overall number for those years as being a negative rather than a positive amount, would not change the augmented annuities that we believe should have been paid. And so they wouldn't change the present value of the augmented annuities. It's just, in that sense, irrelevant to this court to know whether the Crown lost a lot or only a medium amount on NCRs. In either case, the augmented annuities would have been paid, and they would have been paid in precisely the same amount.
Is there anything else you'd like to say about slide 74?
No, thank you.
All right, let's move on to slide 75. I think 4:25 p.m. is a good time to discuss complex accounting.
You just had to throw in that extra number.
I take it that you don't have calisthenic breaks in Superior Court, so be it. So on slide 75, we're beginning to take up these specific issues raised by Mr. Hutchings, which I need to respond to. So that's what I'll start to do. In his reply report, Mr. Hutchings raised an issue about rather than one specific point. He was trying to make the general point that the share of expenses of the resource ministries that we excluded, he seemed to be claiming it was lower than we reported it to be. And that statement is not correct. In our server reply, we explained, I think, what was happening that would lead him to conclude that. What happened was that many of the programs that are excluded in our accounts are now being reported on a net basis in the public accounts. That means the spending is reported, but only after deducting the fee revenues the Crown collects to support those programs. A key example of that is the approach to parks in the accounts today. So those expenses are reported in the PAO for the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry today, the M&R in recent years as well. But instead of reporting the total amount spent on parks, which we would then exclude, parks are not relevant here, they report only the amount spent on parks net of the amounts collected in park fees of various kinds. So that appears to be a small number that we're excluding today. In the past, the government's approach was different. They reported the full amount of spending on parks on a gross basis, and separately they reported the revenues that they received from parks. And so when we exclude the parks expenses in the past, we're excluding a large number. We're excluding the revenues as well, of course, but it appears to be a relatively high share. Now, even though we're excluding all of parks, and parks are still expensive, it appears to be a smaller number we're excluding because of this new practice in the PAO. So in our SIR reply, we suggested that might explain the concern that Mr. Hutchings had about the share. He may have accepted that that is correct. I believe he has, because in his testimony, he raised a separate issue. He said, in effect, he said, yes, that is the case. The PAO now records expenses on a net basis. He said in his testimony, which he did not say in his reply report, that therefore we committed a different error, that the share of included overhead expense should have been calculated in a different way than we did. So at 4:30 in the afternoon, I'm debating with myself how much time to talk about that issue, but it was newly presented in his testimony. I did not have any sense of that objection in his reply report. I also do not have any sense that when he created his own accounts prior to 1945, he did what he's suggesting here should have been done. Because of course there was some netting of expense, even in the pre-1945 period. I don't recall him ever saying that he adjusted for the netting of revenue against expense in his own overhead accounts. But in any case, I'm quite sure that the impact of any such adjustment, which we have not done, we didn't do what he suggested at trial we should have done. But if we did, I'm quite certain the effect of that on our overall estimates would be small. The main reason is because it would be most impactful in the recent years. In the recent years, we have estimated large NCR losses to the Crown. Any such change would have a small impact on the magnitude of those losses, but the losses would still be there. And these are years in which there are no augmented annuities in our accounts. Crown was not earning sufficient NCRs by that date to be able to pay augmented annuities in our estimation without incurring loss. All of our augmented annuities pertain to NCRs that accrued in much earlier years where this issue really doesn't arise. So we could do what he said. We don't think that we should, and we don't believe that he did it either, but it would not affect the value of augmented annuities by $1.
I think now is a good time to break for the day.
Thank you. Let me just catch up. Okay.
All right. Oyez, 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 the sitting of this court is not concluded on the 15th.